Hey guys, so this is a review of the plot diagram for Thank You, Ma'am. So remember, a plot diagram is essentially sort of like a summary. You are breaking apart the parts of the story and putting them in a visual representation. And the very beginning of the story is the exposition. That's where you learn a little bit about your characters. And depending on what kind of piece you're reading, it might be really, really short. Like a short story might have like a sentence or two of exposition, whereas a novel might have a chapter or two. But this is the part where if it's too long or it's not that interesting, you might say something like, I couldn't get into that book or that story. So the exposition is the background. Then you start to go up your roller coaster and you start to have rising action. This is where most of the story happens right in here. It's like the meat of the story. And during the rising action is also the conflict, which is in this red box. And so a lot of times when you're doing a visual representation, the conflict and the rising action, you might have things that cross over because they're part of the same thing. There's no story without conflict. So you have to have conflict, but of course not every single sentence is conflict. And so there are some things that are just part of the rising action. I will say, usually we get our setting in the exposition. So I'll just step back a second. So in the setting is where and when the story takes place. Sometimes that really, really matters. And it's super important. And sometimes it's not as important. This story, it is important because our characters are in New York City or a large city. And it's late at night. And that does matter because our character is going to be trying to rob somebody. We'll talk about that. So after the rising action and the climax, or the conflict, is the climax. It is the turning point. It's at the point where the character does or has something happen to them or experiences a mental and emotional change to the point that it changes the rest of the story. They cannot go back. And if you think of it like the roller coaster analogy, they are committed to going down the rest of the roller coaster. You have to keep going at that point because something changed. That's the climax. It's also usually the most exciting part of the story. And then, of course, your falling action is what happens directly after the climax. And then the resolution is kind of like how it's summed up. Do they live happily ever after? Do they have, is it a chapter or a paragraph, or in a movie, is there a title card that says, 1 year later, 1 week later? Not every story has a resolution, especially if the story is like in a couple of stories you guys have read, it's part of a larger book. Or if there's going to be another story or another novel, if it's like a two movies or a trilogy or whatever. So sometimes there's not a resolution, but in this story there is. So let's get into the specifics. So in Thank You, Ma'am, we open in our setting, which is New York City or a large city, at 11 p.m. And that does matter because it's late at night. It adds to the, you're in a city where it's, in theory, not as safe. And it's late at night, which is like, a scary time to be out. And an elderly woman is walking down the street. And that is like, oh no, is she going to be safe? And little do we know, that's our exposition. So then little do we know that actually she's maybe not going to be safe because a young boy approaches her and tries to steal her purse. He actually does get her purse, but it's so heavy that it actually like stops him in the motion. So he gets it, but he can't really get away. And she grabs him. She demands her purse back. He gives it to her. And she asks him, are you ashamed? He says yes. He admits he's ashamed, but then he lies and says that I wasn't really trying to steal your purse. And she calls him a liar. She's just like, yeah, no, that's not true. Yes, you were. And so eventually the woman realizes that Roger has no one at home. So she drags him to her house. And the woman tells him to wash his face and she feeds him. And when asked, Roger says that he was stealing to get money for blue suede shoes. Cause she's like, well, were you stealing for food? And he says, no, I was stealing for these shoes. So that's your rising action. And within that rising action is this conflict. So Roger's trying to steal, that's conflict. MLB, remember this is a graphic organizer, so you can abbreviate. So MLB is Miss Luella Bates, not Major League Baseball. So Miss Luella Bates stops Roger and won't let him go. That's conflict, right? Because he would like to get away, preferably with the purse, but if not, just get away. And then Roger associates the blue suede shoes with having enough. And he's to the point where he's willing to steal for it. He doesn't have enough. So that's conflict. Okay. So he admits she washes them, she cleans them, and he admits why he wanted the money. That's our rising action. So the climax of this story, the turning point where someone, Roger, experiences a change or a mental or emotional change that changes the path of the story, is when Miss Luella Bates goes behind a screen to cook and she leaves her purse in the wide open. Roger could just take it and run. She wouldn't be able to stop him, and he doesn't do it. That's his mental and emotional shift. He has decided not to steal from her, right? This being good to her, this relationship, either with her or how it makes him feel being a good person, becomes more important to him than those blue suede shoes. And remember that the blue suede shoes represent having enough. So having a relationship with her, or being at least respected by her, is now more important than having enough. That's a big change. That's your climax. After that, Miss Luella Bates ends up giving him the $10. That's your falling action. And then she kind of kicks him out on her stoop and he never sees her again. That's your resolution. So it's kind of like it's not like they became like lifelong friends. It's just this one momentary act of kindness, but it was a huge deal for him and it had a huge impact on him. All right. I hope you enjoyed. Bye, y'all.